We're all in some type of relationship. We're all in some type of relationship because we're human. And God created us for relationships. He created Adam to have a relationship with him. And then he said, it's not good that Adam should be alone. Let me give him a woman. And of course, that's where all the trouble started. Amen? I heard all the men say amen.
That's about all.
Devotion said that
As long as men get their want what they want their house.
We're looking at relationships, 4 different types of relationships. In a lot of relationships, we always come in contact with controlling people. I want us to look today at controlling people in our lives. How many of you know a controlling freak?
Oh,
Huh?
Sure. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Someone that wants to control. Why is it that they want to control? They believe they want to control because they feel that they're right and they know what's best for us or for the person that they want to control. And we're going to look to the scriptures today. And the scripture we're going to look at is in Matthew chapter 16. And we're going to use this little story here in Matthew to look at controlling people. It starts here in chapter 16, verse 21. It says, "From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised the 3rd day." So what we have here is Jesus is with his disciples, and he knows what's going to happen, and he comes to his disciples and he says, "Hey, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to be beaten. I'm going to be." He says here that he's going to be killed, raised from the dead. He's going to go through a lot of suffering, and so he's telling his disciples that. Verse 23 says, "Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, 'Far be it from you, Lord, that this should not happen to you.'" We see here that Peter is trying to control. He's trying to control the situation. He takes Jesus aside. He says, "No, this ain't going to happen, Lord. We ain't going to let anybody hurt you. You're not going to do any suffering." He's kind of trying to control the situation. And what does Jesus say here? Verse 23. But Jesus, it says, "But he turned to Peter and said, 'Get behind me, Satan.
Amen.
You're an offense to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men.'" So today I want us to look at controlling people. It could be a parent in our lives, maybe a brother or a sister or a friend, someone that tries to control us. Someone who tries to make you do what they think is right in your life. Now, there's 2 things about the controller, the person that's trying to do the controlling. And their 2 greatest weapons is threats. They'll use threats to make you do what they want you to do. Do this or you're going to regret it. Or you better do this or there's going to be some type of punishment. Or how about if you don't, you'll pay. And then the other thing that the controllers like to do is they like to use guilt. After all I've done for you.
Yeah.
I thought we were friends. Or obviously I can't count on you. These are some of the tactics that controlling people will use in our lives to try to control us. But we see here in the story that Jesus tries to use this on Jesus. No, Jesus. No, this ain't going to happen. And we'll see why it is important to know your calling. To know your calling. Been talking a lot lately about knowing your gifts, knowing your calling, what God's called you to do. I found a gifts test online that I printed up. I went to Office Depot yesterday and printed up these. It's like a 75 question test if you guys want to take it to know what your gifts are.
Amen.
Your spiritual gifts. That way you can know what your strengths are. So where God's calling you. Anybody wants to take these home? It's called a test, but it's really kind of like a survey. There's no right or wrong answers when you take the test. If you're interested, see me afterwards. And it's important to know what our calling is. Jesus was explaining to his disciples here what was going to happen. Of all this was what was going to happen. And Peter comes in and says, no. Well, there's three things that I want us to see in this story here. First, we need to know what we are called to do. We need to know what we are called to do. Jesus knew what he was called to do. He was called to seek and save the sinners, give his life for ransom, be killed and be raised from the dead. Define what you are called to do. When you define what you are called to do, then you know what your task is. This is what Jesus did. He knew what he was called to do. A lot of times in our lives, we don't know what we're called to do. We just go through and say, oh, well, let me do this, let me do that, let me do this. Or someone comes up and says, hey, you need to go and teach this class. Well, if we don't know what we're called to do, well, okay. We may not have any teaching experience, or maybe our gifts don't even have us able to teach. But because others want to control us. So it's important. Maybe you're called to raise your children. Maybe you're called to graduate from school. Maybe you're called to serve in the church. Sometimes we get this idea that, oh, we're going to have this big, great calling. We're going to come up with a cure for cancer. Or maybe we're called to Africa. Your calling doesn't have to be something big and great and grand. For me, I'm called to love my wife.
Amen.
I'm called to lead our children. I'm called right now to pastor this church. Called to Cuba and anywhere else that the Lord calls me to. That's mine. See, I used to have a problem. That I was a people pleaser. I didn't want anybody to be mad at me. And so someone would come up and say, okay, I'll do that. And then I realized that people pleasing is a form of idolatry. We want all these people to like us and with the opinion they have of us. We don't want anybody to have a bad opinion of us. And then I realized that's not what the Lord's called me to. And so if I've ever told you, no, I won't do that, and I had someone in the church, Taffy, one time when she was running children's church, she came up and she asked me, oh, Pastor, I hear that you're a good artist and you can make a drawing. Can you draw this for me? And I'll need 10 copies of it, and this one and this one. She gave me like 3 different of these pictures that she wanted me to draw for. And I told her, no, I'm sorry, Taffy, I can't do it. And she was kind of taken aback. Why not? You have this ability. Because right at this point, I believe it was right before a trip I was getting ready to go on, and I was so focused on this trip, I was like, I'm sorry, I can't take my time to do that. And see, I learned not to be a people pleaser. Now, years ago, I would have said, oh, okay, and I would have gone and I would have stayed up till like midnight making all these drawings for her and stuff and been tired and maybe been off my game. But I had to tell her, no, I'm sorry. Sometimes we have to tell people, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that. And we have to stay more focused. This is why it's important to learn our calling. Calling clarifies. It clarifies. Lots of people have a plan for my time. Oh, the pastor should be doing this, but I can't save everyone. I can't meet with everyone. Even in a small church like this, I can't do everything. That's why you need to know what you are called to do. Calling creates clarity. When we know our calling, when we know what our gifts are, when we know where God's called us to, it creates clarity. What does every controlling person have in common? Someone who allows it. When we allow people to control us, there's a problem. If we consistently allow it to happen, then we consistently fall into problems. Know what you are called to do. The second thing that we need to know as we look at this story is we need to know when someone is trying to control us. Peter tried to take control. He tried to take control. He came up to Jesus and said, no. Now he didn't say it, I'm taking control, but he said, no, I'm not going to let it happen, Jesus. All this stuff that you're talking about, I'm not going to let it happen. Let's go back a little bit more in Matthew chapter 16. It says here in verse 15, it says, Jesus said to them, but who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Bingo! He just won. He just came up with the right answer. Jesus asked this question. Peter steps up and says, "You're the Christ, the living God." Jesus is absolutely thrilled. Look what he says here. He says, Jesus answered him and said, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah," which that's the dad bloodline. "For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Here's Peter that just a few minutes before won. He won it all. He won Jeopardy. He answered the $50,000 question. Jesus says, "Man, Peter, you're the guy. I'm going to build everything on you." And then what happens just a little bit later? Peter starts controlling, trying to control the situation. See, sometimes controlling people, they're not bad people. Peter wasn't a bad person. He didn't come up and say, "No, get out of the way, Jesus. I'm taking over." Sometimes people in our lives, they try to control us, but they have good intentions. It's not bad people sometimes there are bad people in our life. But you have to realize when someone's trying to control you. Because sometimes it may be a parent, it may be a brother, it may be a sister, it may be a child. Sometimes we need to realize when someone's trying to control us. And again, it's not always a bad person that's trying to control us. That's what we see here with Peter. Peter, he wasn't a bad guy. He didn't hate God. He didn't hate Jesus. He was just trying to control for what he thought was good. Amen?
Amen.
And the third thing that we see here is we need to know when to draw the line. Know when to draw the line in the sand. We see here Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." He saw what was happening. He said, "Get behind me, Satan." Sometimes in our lives we have to tell that controlling person, "Get behind me, Satan." Diane, I'm not telling you to go home and tell Bob, call Bob Satan. Ray, I'm not telling you to call your wife Satan. But we need to realize sometimes when this person is trying to control us, and we need to say, no, get behind. You see how important it is to know your calling, to know where God's leading you. So when someone tries to control you and take over, the relationships that you have are combinations of what you've created and what you've allowed. What you've created and what you've allowed. If you don't like what you have, change what you expect and change what you accept. Now, it's easy to point at others and say, "Oh yeah, they're a controlling person there. Yeah, that person, I know that person." But most of us battle with the same things. Most of us are controlling people. And I use this, and I use my wife as an example too. Whenever I go on a mission trip, my wife hasn't been with me for a couple of years now. And every time I go to Cuba, she's been to Cuba before, and I get there, and everybody says, "Well, where's Tara? Where's your wife? Where's your wife? Why isn't she coming?" And some people try to control me, to get me to force her to come. But I know what the calling is on my wife. And right now, for 10 months, she has 48 kids that are first graders that she's been called to. And when I go, she's called to watch the homestead. Remember I talked about this before. Someone has to stay behind. Remember that story? Someone has to stay behind. That's her calling. And so I don't come to my wife and say, "Hey, I really need you to come." And I don't try guilting her, or I don't try getting her to come with me, because I know that's not her calling at this particular time. And so she stays home. And as difficult as it is staying home, because when I come back, I get to see how much she really appreciates me. And I come back and she says, "Oh man, it's hard without you." Huh?
Amen.
And so, see, she knows her calling. And it's the same way. She doesn't come to me and say, "Hey, I don't want you going to Cuba for a week," because when I go to Cuba in March, it's spring break. And she's off the entire week for spring break. And so if I stayed home, we would have a week's of vacation. But she doesn't know. She says, I know God's called you to that. And so she doesn't try to control me to stay there. But each of us in our lives, sometimes we try to control our spouse to do what we want them to do. We can't change our spouse. We can't change our kids. Only God can change them.
That's right.
Only God can change them. And all our efforts will just cause friction in our lives. We need to go to the Lord in prayer and pray that the Lord changes them, gives us the patience that we need most. Jeremiah 29:11 says, for I know, and this is God speaking, I know the plans that I have for you. Sometimes we try to play God. I know what's best for you. No, not what God, that's what Peter's saying to Jesus. I know what's best. Let me play God. And sometimes we do that in people's lives. Whether it's a family member, whether it's someone here at the church, whether it's someone here at work, we try to play God. I don't know about you, but I don't make a good guy. And then neither do you guys. Can somebody give me an amen?
Amen.
Can everybody give me an amen?
Amen.
So, Matthew 16:24, it says, then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross
That's right.
and follow me.
Amen.
We need to deny ourselves. Not what we want. Not what we want our spouse to do. Not what we want our kids to do. Not what we want pastor to do. Not what we want the board to do. Not what we want others to do. But deny ourselves. Deny ourselves. So this morning, and I've been talking a lot about lately our gifts, and working in the church and stuff, and it's all work, not specifically here in this church, but in His church worldwide. Working for the church in your families, in your homes. Working for the church in your community, in your job. When you take the gifts test, you'll find out what your strengths are. And then you'll see through your strengths, you'll see how God opens the doors for you to use your gifts. He'll give you the opportunity to use your gifts. He'll give you the desires of your heart.
Amen.
That you'll want to work, whether it's in children's ministry or whether it's whether you're a worker and you need to keep busy and you need to clean. He'll give you the desires of your heart. He'll open the doors and give you the opportunity to work. Would you stand with me this morning?
Oh.